Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible Bits. We're going to finish off chapter 4 of Genesis here today. This is I think some people might call this the footnotes of the Genesis account. It doesn't mean this is an unimportant section of Scripture, but if you're talking about Genesis, what do people usually mention? The fall, creation story, Noah, Abraham. Uh, a guy like Enoch doesn't get a whole lot of mention unless you're talking about apocryphal books. You don't get a whole lot of mention of Enoch otherwise. And there's a whole lot of folks like Enoch running through the Genesis account. That doesn't mean their stories are unimportant or they have nothing to say to us, but typically these aren't the ones that Christians pass around the stories about from day to day. We talk about the other folk quite a bit more. So we're going to go through this here today and see if we can glean something from it. I'm going to mispronounce a bunch of names most likely, so you'll get to enjoy that if nothing else. Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jabal. You might say, that sounds like the same name. Trust me, they're spelled differently. They just, as far as I can tell, I'm pronouncing them correctly. He was the father of all those who played the lyre and pipe. Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also was born a son was also born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, you might think to yourself, the ending part of Genesis 4 there seems very different from the rest of Genesis 4. Up until now, we've been following Cain and his lineage, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, we move over to Adam again. And you're right. There's a shift at the very end of Genesis 4 from the what you might call the failed bloodline. That's not to say that Cain's bloodline ended or anything like that. But in terms of sinfulness, Cain's bloodline was clearly going the wrong way. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there's also a shift there to the divine bloodline. And when I say divine, I don't mean as if Seth was himself somehow more divine. He had a great name. I don't think we can debate that. But he wasn't more divine or anything than, say, Adam. But it was through that line that eventually we would get to Jesus, of course. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who came through Seth was therefore, a holy person, or that everyone who came through Cain was evil. But rather, there's a shift in the narrative at that point, returning back to God's ordained plan. What Cain had done and the way that his offspring were going, that was not God's plan. It was clearly going the wrong direction. And in fact, we see as time goes on, by the time we get to Noah, mankind is in complete disarray. And in fact, we see seeds of that here with the children of Cain, specifically with Lamech. Lamech's poem is interesting. If you read the poem in English, you probably think to yourself, Lamech is telling his wives he's killed somebody because whoever he was fighting with wounded him, whether it be a serious wound or a minor wound, not clear. He got wounded. He got wounded, so he killed somebody. And he's defending himself by saying, hey, it wasn't my fault. That's kind of what the English sounds like. But the Hebrew is not quite so clear. It's not clear that Lamech's actually saying he's killed anyone. It kind of sounds like Lamech might be saying, if anyone comes after me, I'm going to kill them. I think this is indicative of how mankind was going post-fall. We go from Adam to Cain, and Cain kills Abel. And you see in Cain an attitude of anger and frustration that boils over into that murder. Then from Cain you go down and we find here Lamech. And now Lamech's at the point where he's saying, if anyone comes at me, I'm going to go ahead and kill them. Now, even if we take this on the face of it and say that Lamech did, in fact, fight somebody and kill them, certainly we wouldn't think that for being wounded or being struck, that therefore it was okay for Lamech to kill somebody. Now, of course, they could have been in a serious tussle. There's nothing about the story that indicates either way, whether he was in a serious fight or a non-serious fight, but there is a sort of crassness about the way Lamech goes about this whole thing, to the point where he even says, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then my revenge should be 77-fold. He seems to think that he has somehow found the right course of action. His revenge was righteous. His actions were righteous. But really, they're not. Even if Lamech was in fact talking about an attack that happened, Lamech took his own vengeance. Throughout Scripture, God makes it clear we're not to take our own vengeance. We're supposed to leave that up to Him. Why? Because we're imperfect judges. We will make mistakes. We are more prone to be like Lamech than like someone, say Jesus. Jesus would turn the other cheek. Lamech would see if he can hit as hard as he can. We would be more like Lamech. So we're told throughout Scripture, don't be your own avenger. Leave that up to the law. Leave that up to people specifically set aside for that, or leave that up to God. But we see here mankind is swiftly moving towards its own evil ends. Lamech is saying to himself, or saying to his wives, I'm going to take control of anything that happens, whether it be someone coming at me or whether he actually did end up taking control and fighting someone. Lamech is taking judgment into his own hands. It's a bad direction for mankind to be going in, and we see when we get to Noah, mankind's just been spiraling downward the whole time. We're very much like that in the modern age. I don't know if you've looked around you in the world today, but we don't seem to be going in the right direction, do we? It's strange that the further we get from God's commands, the worse off we seem to do, isn't it? It's not an accident, of course. The further we get from God's commands, the further we get from His moral guidance, the worse off our interactions are, because we start making our own judgments. And our own judgments, like Lamech's judgments, are flawed. You might notice that Lamech also took 2 wives, the first notice of any polygamy in Scripture. Now God nowhere here condemns him, but you might also notice that God doesn't commend it. And it's not clear whether or not there was strife in that family, whether that polygamy ended up playing out in trouble. But throughout Scripture, we see that polygamy tends to end up with trouble. It's not the reflection of God's perfect desire for marriage. In Genesis chapter 2, what is it? Man is supposed to cleave to his wife. But when mankind makes it wives, well, a lot of trouble ends up following. Whether it's Abraham with Sarah and Hagar, or whether it's Jacob with Rachel and Leah, the trouble seems to just kind of descend when you have this polygamous marriages. And God doesn't necessarily come in and condemn them and say, hey, you have to stop this right now. But you see, it's not working out the way it's planned, because mankind starts to do its own thing. They start to go their own way. And as we go our own way, what happens? Trouble follows. But thankfully, chapter 4 doesn't end with mankind going its own way. It ends with God sending one more son to Adam. And notice here, when Eve calls his name Seth, she doesn't say, as she did for Cain, I have gained. She says, God has appointed for me. Notice how she's turned back to God. When she gets Cain, she's inwardly focused. What have I got? But when she gets Seth, she realizes she was looking the wrong direction. God has now given me something. And then Seth, it says, gave birth, he didn't give birth, but to Seth was a son born named Enosh. And then people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That doesn't mean that people were unaware of God prior to that point. Clearly, Adam walked with God in the garden. He knew God. There's no doubt that Cain and Abel knew God. The whole issue with Cain going and murdering Abel stems from a failed sacrifice. But it's in Enosh that people begin to call on the name of the Lord. What does that probably mean? It probably means they were beginning to turn back towards God's plan. We have to be very careful about going our own way. Sometimes it's hard when we read Scripture and we see things that, on the face of them, don't agree with what's going on in the culture. Scripture says one thing, and the people on the news say another. And it can be difficult sometimes. We have that pressure, especially in social situations, to bend to the will of whatever is going on in the moment. But whenever we see in Scripture mankind deciding to go its own direction, in fact, whenever we see mankind going its own direction today, what do we see at the end of it? We see famine. We see war. We see people at each other's throat. We see nations divided. We see people going hungry when there's no need for anyone to go hungry. We see people poor and in the streets when we know for a fact that they should be able to handle themselves. That doesn't mean that every single person who's in a bad situation is somehow a victim of an evil culture. Sometimes people make their own choices, but isn't that the point? People make their own choices. They don't follow God's commands. They seek their own way. Don't try to take vengeance on your own. Don't try to forge your own way, deciding for yourself how things will go. Instead, take up the end of Genesis 4. Take up the point in time when God sent back a corrector for his plan. It came through Seth, not me, the biblical Seth. And then went to Enosh when they began to call on the name of the Lord. That's our proper direction, to call upon the name of the Lord. So that's a minor point in Genesis. I hope that's of help to you. If you thought that was a boring one, get ready for Genesis 5 when it's all genealogies. That'll be fun, but that'll be in the next video. Until then, we'll see you later, everybody.